Okay. Thank you very much, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. This is quite an impressive crowd. We've had meetings like this or public lectures like this with a colleague of mine, Kari Tikkinen, one that showcased Alan Francis, just to let you know, and another one with Richard Smith speaking, and I have to say that this is the biggest crowd so far, so something in Peter Gøtzsche attracts people. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to introduce our guest speaker, who to most of you probably is or you are familiar with him, but just a brief history of what Peter has achieved. He is one of the founding members of the Cochrane collaboration and was actually appointed to the governing board just a month ago or something like that. So for those of you who claim that Peter isn't in good books in the Cochrane collaboration, I venture to claim the opposite. Peter Gøtzsche has worked in the pharmaceutical industry. You must be very proud of that. Because that probably was a very important experience for him when he's been criticizing some of the practices within the industry. He is the man who knows the stuff from inside. Peter has been instrumental in promoting evidence-based medicine. Some of the biggest inventions in medicine, in the way we practice evidence-based medicine, are things that Peter has introduced into medicine. The concert statement and practices like that. But at the same time, he has been very critical about a lot of things. Mammography was probably the first one, or at least the most famous at the time. Then general health checks were something that you have criticized. But lately the tide has turned a little bit. No, you haven't become any less critical, but you have shifted your focus on psychiatry. And this is why at least I'm here today, to learn a title that can be considered very provocative, but remember, however you feel about something, you have to remember that it's a reflection of your own beliefs. So for some of us, the title over there is very provocative. For others, that is just something that is written based on evidence. With this, thank you, Peter. It is an honor to ask you to present your 75-minute lecture, hopefully, on psychiatry drugs.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Teppo, for organizing this. Teppo is a magnificent organizer. I have known that for a couple of years now. The reason I worked in the drug industry was I didn't know what to do. I was a biologist and I studied insects near Varkaus in Finland. And I didn't know what to do, so my grandfather told me, why don't you go into the drug industry? He was a family doctor, and I did. And I quickly realized I need to get out of here. And I took the worst way out. I studied medicine, so I have two educations, as a biologist and a doctor. So sometimes I have nightmares about taking a third education. So I'm glad when I wake up and no more exams. Okay, so that's my little story. And let's go on. Now, it has become more and more easy to get a depression diagnosis. And we don't have more people with severe depression, but we have more people that get a diagnosis of depression because it's very easy to get it nowadays. And in America, they say that 10% are depressed at any given time, according to these criteria they use over there. Now Trump has been elected, it's probably worse. And you were depressed if you had little interest or pleasure in doing things for more than 7 days out of 14, plus just one additional symptom, which could be many things. Now, I've had a Finnish girlfriend, actually. That's why I was in Varkaus. And when she left me, I wasn't too happy. So what happens when you get discarded? Well, maybe you feel bad for all 14 days. Maybe you can't sleep too well. Then you are depressed. Or you don't eat too much. Then you are depressed. Or you eat too much. Then you are American. And then you run around more than you usually do. Well, you might have gotten a big grant or something, or being invited to the Daily Show in New York, as I once was. I was very happy about that. I loved Jon Stewart. But I never saw him. I was just part of their show. But anyhow. So then you can get a diagnosis of depression. And then you usually get a pill. And one of the things that has been criticized a lot is when you lose a loved one who dies. How long can you be sad without getting a diagnosis of depression? 1 year in 1980? 2 months? 2 weeks? Why not 2 days in the next edition of the diagnosis manual? Why not 2 hours? Why can't the psychiatrists get enough? They have enough patients already. They don't have enough time to talk to them. So they give them pills. Maybe they should have fewer patients and talk to them. Of course, this is not what happens in practice. If you're a family doctor, you don't have the DSM because it's hugely expensive. And if you had it, you wouldn't look up and say, oh, so you feel sad? Well, according to this Bible, it's only for 1 week. You will have to wait another week. And then you will have a pill. I mean, that's not how doctors are. They just get a pill, usually. Now, if we can't find anything wrong with you, so we are going to treat you for symptom deficit disorder. This is actually the situation right now. Studies have been made in general practice that half of the people they put on antidepressant pills don't have any legitimate indication for these pills. It can be everything. So that just makes the problem worse. Now, the FDA in America, the drug agency, was forced to do a huge analysis of 100,000 people participating in placebo-controlled trials of antidepressants. This was because of suicides in children. I'll come back to that. But they also looked at the benefits. 50% responded on drug, 40% on placebo. Well, the 40% in the placebo group is not a placebo effect. When I criticize antidepressant drugs, psychiatrists very often say, well, maybe they are not so effective, but then at least patients benefit from the placebo effect. The placebo effect is not what you see in a group that is depressed, and then after 4 weeks, you see the difference. That's not a placebo effect. If you want to study the placebo effect, you need to randomize to placebo and nothing. Then you can see what the placebo effect is. The placebo effect, we have been unable to detect it in antidepressant trials. So what we see in a placebo effect is the spontaneous healing of a depression. People get better if you don't do anything, okay? That's not an argument for using pills, that people get better by nature. And this 10% difference is seriously biased because it is very subjective to decide if someone has improved. So you need to be absolutely certain that the trials are double-blind. They are not, because these drugs give people side effects. So in most cases, the doctor and the patients will have guessed who got active drug, who got placebo, and then we know the effect is being exaggerated by the psychiatrist. Now, I had a PhD student that looked into this. He collected 21 trials in all sorts of diseases. There were not more than 21, which had a blinded and an unblinded outcome assessor. So he wanted to see how much does an unblinded outcome assessor exaggerate the effect. And of course, most trials had used subjective outcomes, and he found the effect was exaggerated by 36% on average. That's a huge bias. What if the blinding had been broken for all patients in the depression trials? Then the 10% difference would, of course, be 0. But you only need to break the blinding in 5% of them if you then misclassify the outcome in all cases. So the 50% on drug becomes 45, the 40% on placebo becomes 45, no effect. So you don't need to break the blinding in very many patients before your result may be nothing. Now, this has been studied by putting something into the placebo that gives people similar side effects as antidepressant drugs. Then you can't guess whether you got active or placebo. That's ingenious. This has been done. There are 9 trials. They put atropine in the placebo, and then the drugs didn't work on depression. Only one on a scale that goes to 52, that's nothing, because 5 to 6 is the bare minimum that can be perceived as a change. So 1 is nothing. And the bare minimum that can be perceived as a change does not mean that the patients have improved, okay? If you can see light for the end of a tunnel, it doesn't mean that there is enough light to read a newspaper. You need more than that, okay? So this is very depressing. And these studies are very old because nowadays the drug industry will not collaborate with you if you say, I need to do better trials and put something in the placebo. Can you produce that for me? Oh no, that would be unethical, they would say immediately. You won't get there. But of course, you can ask pharmacists to do this for you. So there is no excuse for not doing better trials. Now, even though the industry makes almost all of these trials, and they manipulate with the design and data analysis and all the rest, torture your data until they confess. And if they don't confess, you won't publish. Very easy, okay? So we can't trust drug industry trials in the world literature, but let's assume we can trust them. What do they tell us? Well, this is children. Standardized mean difference, that's a statistical term, don't worry about that. According to the psychiatrists, these drugs work for children. This is statistically significant, but 2 points on the Hamilton scale. That's not clinically relevant. What do the children say? These drugs don't work for us, okay? What do the adults say? The same, these drugs don't work for us. Who says they work? The psychiatrists. But the psychiatrists are not those you are going to treat. You're treating the patients, and they say they don't work. So why do the psychiatrists use drugs that their clients say don't work for them? It doesn't make any sense. Now, here is an American statistician who gets a lot of money from the drug industry. He got hold of data from trials of fluoxetine and venlafaxine, and then he could see day for day how it went for people with severe depression. 21 on Hamilton is severe depression, and the black squares are on drug, and the white ones on placebo. So it takes a long time. After a month, you are mildly depressed, so you have become considerably better on drug. How much longer does it take before you are also mildly depressed when you get nothing but a placebo? It takes 1 more week. And these trials are badly flawed. They are all industry trials. There's no atropine in the placebo. It's only the psychiatrist evaluation. If you have asked the patients, they would probably have had the same curves because they tell you they don't work. So what does this mean? Patients, not people, but have patience. I mean, be patient. You could tell your patients about all the horrible side effects of antidepressant drugs and then say, just wait a couple of more days and you will be fine without drugs. You will be equally fine without drugs. Can't you see how insane it is that here in Finland, you treat perhaps 300,000, 400,000 with antidepressant drugs for all sorts of things: depression, anxiety, divorce, failed an exam, I'm just anxious, whatever. It's crazy. And just one example, you can't trust the published literature. Pfizer has a drug called reboxetine. Only one trial was published, and that trial was positive. But there were 6 unpublished trials that didn't show anything, that Pfizer had buried deep in their archives. They had to provide them, because in Germany, they told Pfizer, we will not reimburse your drug unless we get all the trials from you. So Pfizer had to give them the negative trials. So that's the only reason we know that this drug doesn't work, just like the other ones. But I mean, this is so clear that you can't trust what is in the literature, which is what psychiatrists read. So maybe you can't blame them for being too positive towards that. Oh, well, you can blame them, but I won't do that too much tonight. Some of them are deeply corrupt, for example. And those are those who tend to do the drug trials, are the worst ones, who are most corrupted. So, well, we can blame them, definitely. Now, if these drugs really were more beneficial than harmful, then people would stay on them. They don't. They drop out of the trials equally quickly when they're on active drug as when they're on placebo. So again, they don't work. And in clinical practice, only after 2 months, half of the patients have stopped taking the drug. Now, in my country, psychiatrists say that it's very important to convince the patients to take these drugs. Very important, because it takes time before they work, so they need to take them. And if they get side effects, it will probably be better with time. So please continue taking these drugs. Why? Does it need convincing me if I have pneumonia and I get penicillin? No, I would love to take it because it might save my life. Drugs that you need to convince people taking them against their will? What kind of drugs are they? What if these drugs were bought in the pharmacy without prescription and people were depressed and they went and bought an antidepressant drug and then they thought, what the hell is this? That I'm not going to eat. There wouldn't be many people on antidepressant drugs. And when these newer antidepressant drugs came on the market, actually people were very skeptical of them. The German drug regulator didn't want to approve Prozac because it was totally unsuitable for the treatment of depression. And what happened? It became one of the most sold drugs of all. And the psychiatrists, they laughed of it and say, how can you ever think you can register such a horrible drug? But then they were bribed. And then it all worked fine. Many doctors and patients, of course, think that these drugs work for depression, but they forget about the natural cause of the depression. They don't know they might have been better if they didn't take a drug, okay? But people really believe this must be the drug. And of course, in some cases, people become euphoric or even manic on antidepressant drug. And in other cases, they become more depressed on antidepressant drug. So on average, nothing really happens. But these drugs are quite harmful. I'll come to that. So we should take them off the market, because when something does more harm than good, it's too dangerous to let doctors have access to it. You need to take it off the market. But that will be my conclusion. I'll show you some more data first. But you don't treat depression to improve a Hamilton score. You treat depression to get people back to work, to save intimate and other relationships, and to prevent suicide. More than 1,000 trials have been done on antidepressants. I have not seen one that looked at these outcomes that really matter to people. Not one. So we don't know what they're doing. And since they cause sexual problems in half of those that had a normal sex life before they were treated, it's not likely to exactly save intimate relationships. And these sexual disturbances, they are pretty disturbing. Decreased libido, delayed orgasm or ejaculation, no orgasm, no ejaculation at all, erectile dysfunction, decreased vaginal lubrication so that it hurts to have intercourse. Some patients yawn during orgasm. It's not a common side effect, but can you imagine the conversations in the bedroom? The guy is wildly in love. Did you also yawn with other girls you have known? No? Then why me? I don't know. And then next time he yawns again, right in climax. I mean, you can yawn later, but not in the middle of the whole thing. And now I come to the serious part. When I lectured for Australian psychiatrists and pediatricians and told them about that, a child psychiatrist said he had recently 3 boys who were going to have sex for the first time in their life. So, of course, they were incredibly excited. I mean, it takes years before you have sex for the first time after you wanted to have sex. You wait and wait and wait, and then one day the big moment comes, and you can't get an erection. What do you think these boys think about themselves? There's something wrong with me? All 3 boys attempted suicide because they couldn't get an erection the first time they attempted to have sex. This is very serious stuff. It's not trivial issues. Now, these drugs make people dependent, like benzodiazepines, but it was not listed among side effects in the UK. It was listed in a text. When people stop these drugs, about half of them have problems. So we recommend to reduce the dose gradually over a period of at least 1 week. That is really a British understatement. In the worst cases, it can take years to take a person off an antidepressant drug. And in even more worse bad cases, you never succeed with it. They continue for life. But this tells you how little our authorities know about the drugs they have approved. This was an official recommendation, and also the drug companies. Now, I had a researcher who found out that the withdrawal symptoms when you stop were very much the same for antidepressant drugs as for benzodiazepines, but they were not described as dependence for these happy pills, only for benzodiazepines. This makes no sense. And for patients, it's just the same. If you ask patients, half of them will say it's difficult to stop with antidepressants. The psychiatrist who did this study concluded the patients are ignorant. They need some psychoeducation. Then they won't think it's difficult to come off antidepressant drugs. When you stop listening to your patients, you are no longer a good doctor, okay? That's the message they conveyed in that study. I have discussed this with psychiatrists that stubbornly say that you don't become dependent on antidepressant drugs. Why not? No, because in order to become dependent, you need to increase the dose to crave bigger and bigger doses, like if you take heroin. Okay, I said, then no one is dependent on cigarettes. When they smoke 20 cigarettes every day, they don't increase the dose, so they can stop anytime. Great. That's good news for tobacco smokers. Then they didn't say anymore. But how can they believe in such nonsense? I don't understand this. Now, in 2003, the UK drug regulator said that these drugs are not addictive, but the same year the World Health Organization published a report that 3 of these antidepressant drugs were among the top 30 highest ranking drugs for which drug dependence had ever been reported. And this includes opiates, morphine. The same year, GlaxoSmithKline was forced to admit that maybe not only 0.2% became dependent on these drugs, maybe 25%. That's a 100 times increase. So again, you can't trust these people. Now, here is a very important study. People who had become well, but still took antidepressants after they had become well, and had taken them for 4 months up to 2 years, suddenly they got 5 to 8 days on placebo, but no one told them when that happened. And what happened if your drug has a short half-life? It comes quickly out of the body. 1/3 develop worsened mood, irritability, agitation, Hamilton score increase of at least 8. That's a pretty remarkable Hamilton increase. So what you could say is that maybe 1/3 of these patients who were well became more or less depressed when they suddenly got placebo for 5 to 8 days. That's not a true depression. This is abstinence. This is an abstinence depression. That's something else. If these people get full dose immediately, then within a couple of hours, most of them will feel fine. Exactly like if you give an alcoholic that ran out of vodka, a bottle of vodka, that's fine within a couple of hours. It's the same. It's not a true depression. So this is a good diagnostic test. But the doctors cannot handle this. By far, most doctors, they will tell you, if you forget your pills for a weekend and you become very unwell, then almost all doctors will say, there you see, you still need the pills, so then you can go on till you die. They don't understand what they are doing. I'm sorry, I'm not exaggerating. That's how it is. Yeah. And these are Finnish data. I got them from a Finnish journalist. If you put 100 people on antidepressants in Finland, then how many are still on the same or another antidepressant a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later? Almost half of them 5 years later. Now, of course, they're also used for anxiety and other things, but if you get a depression in 2008, what is the likelihood that you will get a depression exactly in 2013? It's not very high. Maybe a couple of people will get a depression 5 years later in that time period. But it's almost 50%. So this is an addiction curve. And the worst thing is it flattens out. And out here you have those who are on antidepressants indefinitely. We know for psychiatric drugs that likely all of them may damage your brain permanently if you take them for many years. Likely all of them. So this is very serious. Now, then still half of the patients have been told you have a chemical imbalance. There's something wrong with your brain. That's why you are depressed or psychotic. And now you have a pill that will correct your chemical imbalance. This is one of the worst lies psychiatry has ever invented. There is no scientific documentation for this. It's a fairy tale, and it's incredibly harmful. Because when a patient wants to come off a drug, the doctor can say, now if you had diabetes, would you just suddenly stop your insulin? Of course they wouldn't. So they keep them on these harmful drugs by this lie. And it also stigmatizes people and makes some of them lose hope, because if I have a chemical imbalance, I will have it for the rest of my life. So I'm permanently wrong in some way. I will never get completely healthy. So it's very, very bad. It's one of the many lies in psychiatry. And the really good psychiatrists, they know that it's a lie. But many psychiatrists still use it when they see patients to convince them to take drugs they don't like to take. If it were really true that it was like insulin for diabetes, then when the usage of drugs went up like this, then disability pensions should go the other way. If it was like insulin for diabetes, that doesn't happen. In all countries where this has been investigated, when drug use goes up, so do disability pensions. I don't say there is a direct relationship, but there is a relationship because we know that most of these drugs make it more difficult for people to return to work. That has been documented. So we are doing the wrong things. Now, I told you the FDA was forced to look at suicides. And what they published was it's only dangerous up till age 25. If you're 26, it's okay. You can take antidepressants safely. This is not true. Now, I have studied this in great detail. In the FDA's huge analysis of 100,000 people, there were just 5 suicides on drug in 50,000 people. That's 1 per 10,000. Some small trials that were included in the FDA's big analysis had more suicides, 9 in 7,000 on fluoxetine, 5 in 3,000 on paroxetine. 5 plus 9 is 14. So what happened to the other 9 suicides? They are gone. Now, the GlaxoSmithKline this time. Now, the FDA boss who did this meta-analysis, he reported 1 suicide per 10,000. But he published another analysis 5 years earlier where he found 22 suicides in 22,000 patients on drug. That's 10 per 10,000. Isn't it incredible that you can have a span of a factor of 10 in suicides in randomized trials? It should be impossible. But now the feet or the bottom were burning under the FDA because they had approved dangerous drugs. So now they did not want to find suicides. How to avoid finding suicides? You tell your friends in the drug industry, go home and see what you have in terms of suicides in your database and relax, we won't check you. I have published another book where I document that the drug industry uses organized crime. And does the police tell a suspect to go back to the crime scene and collect evidence and tell the criminal, I won't check you, we will believe you, and then we'll go directly to the judge and you will be free? That's not how police work is. That's how the FDA operates when it comes in trouble itself. It's very bad science. We know that the drug companies have cheated tremendously with this, and I will come back to that. So I have worked out that there are likely to have been 15 times more suicides than reported, also publicly in the British Medical Journal. That's an error of 1,400%. And I'll just mention one reason why. Well, if people became agitated or developed extreme restlessness, they were put on benzodiazepines to calm them down, which means their risk of suicide went down. But then you don't know what the drugs are doing when you also give benzodiazepines to the drug group. Maybe that works also on depression. So, and also events occurring within 24 hours after stopping the drug trial, they were included within 24 hours, but not after 24 hours. People can get a cold turkey much longer than after 24 hours, after a week, after 2 weeks, and then they might kill themselves because of abstinence symptoms. So we need to factor in these additional suicides. But then I come back to that, but then we decided in Copenhagen, we want to study healthy volunteers, because psychiatrists often say, well, of course they commit suicides because they are depressed, and depressed people commit suicides. But that's a poor argument, because you have randomized trials where everybody is depressed. So if you commit more suicide when you're on drug than on placebo, then it surely is a harm of the drug. But nevertheless, you hear these arguments. And I got so tired of hearing these arguments that I thought, yes, we'll study healthy people. That's what we did. Healthy volunteers, and the FDA has defined harms related to suicidality, nightmares and such things that increase the risk of suicide. So we used FDA-defined risk factors for suicide. We didn't invent them ourselves. And then what we found was that the risk of suicide was doubled in healthy volunteers when they took a drug compared to when they took placebo. Okay? Then we went on and looked at middle-aged women with urinary incontinence. Eli Lilly wanted to sell their drugs to everybody, including women with urinary incontinence, so why not study that? It's a subjective outcome, and the trials are not adequately blinded, so it works. It doesn't work, but it looks like it works, okay? Well, first the FDA. The FDA did not approve this drug for urinary incontinence. And they found that there were 2.6 times more suicide attempts when these women were on drug than in comparable women at similar age out in society. This was when they took the drug openly, not in a randomized trial. Now, we then looked at the randomized trials. There were just 4 randomized trials, but we cannot trust the published data. We never can trust. So we went to the European Medicines Agency and got the clinical study reports. They took up 7,000 pages, including individual patient data. So my researchers read everything. And then we could see that these drugs increased the risk of suicide with a factor of 4 to 5 compared to placebo. That's really something. And it also increased the risk of having a psychotic event. These drugs can also give you psychosis, emotional blunting, where you don't care about yourself and your friends and your family. And it can give you this extreme restlessness that predisposes, it increases the risk of suicide and homicide. And as some of you might know, the Finnish school shootings, they were on antidepressants, I've been told, and very often in America as well. And the German wing pilot and the bus driver in the Alps that killed about 20 children from Belgium, that was also a problem with antidepressants. You don't do that normally. If you want to commit suicide, you just kill yourself. You don't kill 20 school children. There's something badly wrong. You don't take a whole plane with you and plan your murder very carefully unless you're on horrible drugs. That doesn't normally happen. So we could show this. Now, many suicidal events had been coded as something else by the companies. They called them admission to hospital or lack of effect on the depression in their published reports, and didn't tell their readers what the problem was. That, I will think, is fraud. And only people at very low risk of committing suicide were recruited for the trials. Now, if I invented a heart drug, I would not test it in Champions League footballers, because they don't get heart problems. I would test it in old people who get heart problems. So when the drug industry carefully excluded everyone at risk of suicide, doesn't this tell you that they had an idea that these drugs are probably not good for suicides? maybe they will even increase the risk of suicide, which is what they do, because they had also done animal experiments. If you give Prozac to cats, they become very unfriendly. And when you take it away from them, they become cats. Here is what you can see if you get access to internal company documents through court cases in the United States. All three companies, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, they cheated the same way. If you did a trial and you stopped the drug, the trial was over and someone killed themselves out there, this suicide was transferred to the placebo group because the patient didn't get a drug. But it could very likely be a side effect of the drug, an abstinence symptom. And what about if somebody had a suicide up here before the patients were randomized? Then it was added to the placebo group because the patients didn't get a drug. This is fraud. And it could only be detected because Wales psychiatrists had access to internal company documents. So that's what the drug industry is doing to us. They drive children into suicide with happy pills. There are psychiatrists in Finland and Sweden and everywhere who say it's not right. These drugs protect children against suicide. Why do the health authorities warn against this and say you shouldn't use antidepressants in children? Why is it possible that some doctors can say it's the other way around? I'll come to that. It's right here. Here can you see the number of government disability due to mood disorder? It just goes up like a rocket. Here you have the consumption of antidepressant drugs in the United States. And what about suicide rates? They increased in the same period by 24%. So it looks like that these drugs cause suicide. But of course, you should be careful with such correlations. But what these Finnish doctors do, and Swedish doctors, they find a particular country and a particular time period where the opposite happens. That consumption goes down, suicides go up. There you have it. These drugs protect you against suicide. I don't know what you will call that kind of behavior. I will leave that to you. But it can be deadly. Now, yeah, that's funny, isn't it? Götzsche and Götzsche. I wasn't drunk. That's actually my daughter. So her first study was Daddy. We did that this winter because we wanted to find out, since antidepressants are so bad, and since there is a Cochrane review that tells us that people who have tried to commit suicide or harmed themselves in other ways, cutting, for example, if they are put on psychotherapy, they reduce the risk of more cuttings, more self-harm, more suicide attempts. So then we said, what about if we only look at suicide? Only those trials that only recruited people with a recent suicide attempt. And if they get cognitive behavioral therapy, what happens? And we updated the Cochrane review with 2 more trials, and what did we find? Cognitive behavioral therapy reduces the risk of suicide by 50%. This is a huge effect. Now, ask a schoolboy, so what do you think we do in Finland? Use pills that increase suicides, use psychotherapy that dramatically decreases suicide, and the school child would say, psychotherapy. And the teacher would say, no, you failed your exam. You forgot to take the drug industry's massive power and money and influence into account. So try again. This is insane, isn't it? I can't use lesser words for this. So one of my good colleagues, psychiatrist Peter Gøtzsche in the US, says antidepressants are dangerous to start taking. It's dangerous to change the dose. It's dangerous to stop taking them, and they don't work. So the best advice is don't use them. Now, almost all psychiatric drug trials are done this way. You take people who are already in treatment, for example, with an antidepressant drug, then you have a period where they don't get drugs up to a week, then you randomize them to placebo and treatment. What happens here? Some people get cold turkey symptoms, abstinence symptoms, which can be depression. I've just shown that to you. Then you conclude, well, our drug seems to have a small effect on depression when we have harmed the placebo group. Great drug, really. So here you have another reason why the tiny differences on the Hamilton scale are not reliable, because you have harmed the placebo group in all these trials. It's amazing that you can get away with that. And then you ignore what happens after the trial is over, which reflects what happens in clinical practice, where people are not so good at taking any single dose of their drug as in the trials, where they are encouraged to take every single dose. With some of the drugs, just that you forget to take one dose with you in school can be enough to develop abstinence symptoms. Some drugs are so bad that missing one dose is enough. Here you see what happens if you include more suicides. If you only include suicides and suicide attempts up to 24 hours, this is sertraline and this is not children, it's adults. Then nothing really happens. Relative risk about 1. No increased risk of suicide or the other way. When Pfizer looked at their own drug, it looks much better. You reduce the risk of suicide by 50%. But when Pfizer includes data up till 30 days after the trial is over, then it's the opposite. You increase suicide risk by 50%. So you can get any result you like depending on how you look at your data. This is a very important message. And it's difficult to know how dangerous they are in the elderly, but the best study I could find was in people over 65, who in one period used antidepressants, in another period they did not. And then you could see what happened when they used an antidepressant drug. And actually there was one additional death for every 28 people treated for 1 year. That's a annual death rate of 3%. That is very, very deadly. I don't say this is the final answer, but it's the best study I have. And there's no doubt that these drugs kill many elderly people, and there are many reasons for this. One of them is that you tend to lose balance. When you are an old person, no matter what you take that affects your brain, whether it's alcohol or antidepressants or antipsychotics or antiepileptics or whatever it is, and when they fall and break their hip, 20% will be dead within the next year. So that's just one of the reasons. There are several other reasons. Yeah, so it's a very sad story. And they include the risk of violence, homicide, as you have seen, and other psychiatric drugs also do this. Admissions to the FDA, 2,000 cases of violence, 400 homicides. The violence was particularly often reported for psychiatric drugs, antidepressants, benzodiazepines, ADHD drugs. And here are data from Australia. People who had an enzyme deficiency in their liver, so they didn't metabolize the drugs as normal people do. This is very common to have an enzyme deficiency of this type. And you can see, not in a single case was there a good reason for using antidepressant drugs. Distress due to husband's drinking, sister's car crash, anxiety, not earning enough money. And what happened? Stabbed former partner more than 30 times after 11 weeks of terrible restlessness on paroxetine, killed son in manic shift akathisia, the same, delirium after 42 days, and violent akathisia, killed father 4 days after he ran out of pills, killed teenage daughter in toxic delirium after 3 days. Just goes on like that. 2 attempts to kill 2 children, difficulties with in-laws, harassment at work, not an indication for using antidepressant drugs, tried to kill 2 children, jumped in front of train, and it just goes on like that. And the worst part of the story was perhaps that all 10 people became normal when they stopped taking antidepressant drugs. They became themselves. And that was against, very often, the advice of their psychiatrist. So first, they kill someone or nearly kill someone, and then the psychiatrist said, just go on with these drugs. How is this possible? I have no words for this. But that's what happened. Well, if we believe psychiatric drugs are good for people, then we need to decide, should they go on for the rest of their lives, or should they stop at some point? So very many studies have been done where you have these people who are well, then you randomize without a washout period to placebo or continued treatment. And of course, a lot of these people will get a cold turkey. They get abstinence symptoms. And then you conclude, there you see, you have to go on with these terrible drugs. That's like if you want to study, does an alcoholic still need his alcohol? Okay, then we randomize 100 alcoholics to dryness or continued alcohol. And of course, you know the result. Yes, you need to go on drinking for the rest of your life. This is crazy. Then we turn to some other kind of drugs, antipsychotics. The first one came in 1954, and it was considered a chemical lobotomy or a straitjacket. They have no specific antipsychotic properties whatsoever, so to call them antipsychotics is incredibly misleading. Already 1 year later, the hype was extreme. Now they were suddenly good drugs and work like insulin for diabetes, and it emptied the asylums, which is not true. In all countries, it has been an economic consideration, but the fairy tale in psychiatry is antipsychotics emptied the asylums. It's simply not true. But some of you have heard this. Then there was a double-blind trial in the 60s, 50 years ago, National Institute of Mental Health investigators comparing drugs like chlorpromazine with placebo, and of course they had not been blinded effectively because these drugs give terrible side effects. They concluded the exact opposite of what these drugs do to people. Namely, they reduce apathy, they improve motor movement, people walk around more, play football, they become less indifferent. These drugs do exactly the same. This is one of the most shocking revelations for me, that when people are not adequately blinded, they can conclude exactly the opposite of what these drugs do to people. Because then you can imagine what happens in clinical practice when psychiatrists are going to judge the patient. Is the patient better, have more apathy or less apathy, and the psychiatrist believes in these drugs and believes in him or herself? So rather than admitting it doesn't go well, it's very easy to say, well, it goes well. And actually, quite often, the psychiatrist's evaluation contrasts with the nurse's evaluation that know the patients far better, and also the patient's evaluations and the relatives' evaluations. So there, it's important, this thing. So half a century of studies of schizophrenia, they are very poor studies. They're actually not worth the paper they're written on. That was published in the BMJ. But the man who published that then created the Cochrane Schizophrenia Group, where they do exactly that all these poor studies are now being collected into Cochrane reviews. And one of these, well, I will come to that, but I forgot about this slide, that despite all the tremendous flaws in these drug trials, the effect of the newer drugs like Zyprexa and risperidone and so on, it's only 6 on this very commonly used scale, but the minimally clinically relevant change is 15. So the FDA has approved drugs that don't work. It's like antidepressants. It's the same story. But now, oh my God, where did that go? Oh, I apparently changed the order of my slides. I apologize for that. Now, the cold turkey design is actually lethal. 1 in every 145 patients who entered these trials and were taking off drugs in one of the groups, they died within this trial period. And many of them committed suicides because of the cold turkey symptoms. The suicide rate was 2 to 5 times greater than the norm for schizophrenic patients. So this trial design caused people to kill themselves. And it's still being used. And it's actually strange, how can the same psychiatrist tell me, would you take insulin from a diabetic? and then they take these drugs from people that actually kill some of them because of abstinence symptoms. The logic doesn't hold. Now, I really wonder what happened to this other slide that I was going to show you. Well, I'll tell about it, but I'll go on here. If I want to know how many people do antipsychotics kill, I obviously can't use trials where you have harmed the placebo group so tremendously that people kill themselves. Okay? So I went to the old ones. They have also been plagued by antipsychotics, the demented people, and a meta-analysis of people with dementia, which I think they probably did, they might have gotten an antipsychotic anyhow before they were randomized, but less so than people with schizophrenia. And for every 100 people treated for just a few weeks, you killed one of them. And yet you can hear psychiatrists also in Finland and Sweden and Denmark saying antipsychotics make people live longer. And then they refer to some ridiculously poor research. Of course, drugs that are so toxic, they don't make people live longer. They make people live much shorter. It's not only suicides. It's all sorts of other things. You know about weight gain, diabetes, heart problems, sudden death. They suddenly fall dead on the floor because of arrhythmia in the heart, all sorts of other mechanisms. So they lead to irreversible brain damage in a dose-related fashion. You can see it on a brain scan, less chance of getting back to normal life. And you can even develop psychosis while you're still on the drugs. That is called supersensitivity to psychosis. And it also happens on antidepressants that they can prime your brain so that you more easily get a new depression. It's very strange, but that's how these drugs work. Yeah. Here it came. I'm sorry it came so late. This person who said these trials are very bad, he was then first author of a big analysis of chlorpromazine, the first drug versus placebo for schizophrenia, 55 trials. The only thing you need to look at is that in the largest trial, there was less akathisia on drug than on placebo. This is the extreme restlessness that turns some people into committing suicide or murder or both. Now, placebo cannot cause akathisia. This is impossible. This is a horrific harm that you don't just experience on a placebo. So what they saw here was cold turkey in the placebo group. So it looked like that the drug that causes akathisia actually protected people against akathisia. That's totally absurd. They didn't even comment on this in the Cochrane review. Nothing. Now, here's another review that is much better, because they tried to find people who had never gotten an antipsychotic drug before. They don't exist. So they included people where most had a first episode psychosis, but many had a second or third episode psychosis. So they are still flawed, these trials. And then you need not read all that, but they wondered, how come that we treat millions of people with these drugs when we don't know what we are doing? This is exactly my point about antipsychotic drugs. Yeah, so you have seen this before. It's the same. You take people off antipsychotic drugs and they get cold turkey symptoms, and then you continue with them. You need to wait very long to see what they really do to people. But here is a randomized trial where people who had become well were randomized to reduce the dose or to continue the dose for 2 years. And then it was looked at what happened after 7 years. After 7 years, more people had recovered. More people had become healthy when they had their dose reduced or discontinued than those who continued on the drug. And 11 had stopped completely in the dose reduction group versus 6. There are other data that support this, but what you can see is if you use these drugs sparingly, you have a better long-term outcome. That is my point. So you should not If you ask me, we should not use antipsychotics, and you should definitely not force people to take them, because they might kill them. So why don't psychiatrists use benzodiazepines? There is a Cochrane review comparing benzodiazepines with these antipsychotics, and it actually showed that sedation occurred more often on benzodiazepines than on antipsychotics. So if you have an acute psychosis, you might as well give the patients a sleeping pill. Why don't they do that? It's not so dangerous as an antipsychotic drug. They sometimes do it in Denmark, but what does their guidelines say? Antipsychotics, of course, dummy. So there's a lot to be changed. I ask patients when I lecture for them, what would you prefer next time? They all say a benzodiazepine. So why don't they get a benzodiazepine? Here is a famous Finnish result from Lapland, the open dialogue model, Joka. If you take first-time schizophrenia, 72 people in Lapland, 71 people in Stockholm, they are very comparable. And then you don't use antipsychotics much in Lapland, you talk to people. Only 17% still used antipsychotics 5 years later. In Stockholm, it was 75%. What is the outcome after 5 years? How many are on sick leave or disability allowance? 19%, 62%. How many got antipsychotics? Well, if you give antipsychotics, it goes very badly. If you don't, it goes well. So you here in Finland are unique because of your open dialogue model, where instead of using force treatment, bells, all sorts of things, you have this acute team that takes care of the patient within 24 hours, talk to the patient, respects the patient, is human and not a police officer. Makes a huge difference to people. Yeah. That's just to show you how the marketing in the drug industry is. Quetiapine from AstraZeneca was presented as being better than the old drug haloperidol, significantly better, but internal documents showed it was the other way around. Quetiapine was worse than haloperidol. So you can say what you want to people, even the exact opposite. And then AstraZeneca said it has neutral effect on weight. But what did the internal documents tell us? Weight gain of at least 7% in all trials was, of at least 70%, happened for 18% of the people. And of course, the risk of significant weight gain was 2.5. Of course, antipsychotics give you weight problems. Eli Lilly wasn't any better. Now they came in trouble because this is one of the worst drugs to give you diabetes. So the salespeople were told that this is one of the biggest issues we face in the marketplace. The exciting thing is that we now have more data than ever to back up our story. Our story? They're inventing stories of comparable rates of hyperglycemia and diabetes across psychotropic agents. It's critical to our success that we share this information with physicians. What was the evidence for this story? Zero. The evidence said the opposite. And it was the endocrinologist, not the psychiatrist, that had remarked that this Zyprexa is horrible in terms of creating diabetes. Why wasn't it the psychiatrist? They are specialists in this. It was the endocrinologist. Yeah, I'll finish soon, but just a little about ADHD. I don't think we should call it a disease. It's some people who are more irritating than others and have more difficulty concentrating, sitting still. Why should we call them something? There are also people at the other end, these nice little girls that say too little at school. We don't call them anything. Many of us could get this diagnosis. I've tried myself. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Some of the most, well, it's not me, but some of the most successful people I know in this world could easily get this diagnosis because they don't want to listen to a dull lecture, then they leave. if the lecture is horrible. They can't sit still if the lecture is horrible. 11% of school children have it. You can't have something you have invented. It's just a name. But then they have an explanation. Why is Peter behaving like this? That's because he has ADHD. No, we called his behavior ADHD. Then we can't say this is the explanation. That's what people do. We call it circular evidence. And this is a Canadian study. 1 million school children in the same class. If they are born in December, 50% more of them get ADHD drugs than if they are born in January in the same class. What does this mean? Give them a little time to develop their little brains. Then they won't need an ADHD diagnosis. People born in January, they have had 11 more months to develop their brains, so they have become less irritating than those who are born in December. Isn't it heartbreaking to see a study like that? Because they are treated with amphetamine and amphetamine-like drugs, which are illegal if you buy them in the street, but if you get it on prescription, it's wonderful. And they work the same way. So these trials in ADHD are some of the worst I've ever seen. Highly biased, harms vastly underreported. A little group of Harvard psychiatrists have done most of the trials. 21, half of them came from Harvard or Massachusetts, also in Boston. Joseph Biederman was one of the worst guys, co-authoring 1/3 of the trials. Personal payments, millions from Big Pharma, were not disclosed, although that was obligatory. And the children don't like the drugs if you talk to them one by one, so there are no witnesses. Then they'll tell you they don't like the drugs. Now, so what happens is that they can sit still in class, so that's popular with school children, but they don't improve their academic performance, and they reduce social interactions and curiosity. What does that mean? A developing brain needs a lot of curiosity and social interactions. This creates more synapses. It's beneficial for the brain. So this is not beneficial for the brain. Now, some of my colleagues did a huge Cochrane review where they found very low quality evidence. Ritalin in children, 185 trials, terrible, terrible trials, and not adequately blinded. So they wanted something in the placebo to blind them. And they do not produce lasting improvements in academic performance, in accuracy, difficult to pronounce, in anything. I'm sometimes told that it reduces the risk that they become criminals or abuse substances. If anything, there is a tendency to the opposite, which is not strange when you give them amphetamine-like drug. So it's all very bad. And if you look at animals, it seems to harm the brain in the long run. Loss of sexual interest, that's common for all psychiatric drugs. Less tolerance to stress, decreased sensitivity to rewards. That's how you educate your children to give them rewards, so that's not good. And they lose height and weight. And in the worst case, they might suddenly drop dead on the floor. This has happened. It's very rare, but it happens that you kill children with these drugs. Then some of the worst things. The drug has demasked the disease. If you give people an ADHD drug, then the side effects are very similar to the symptoms you use to diagnose bipolar. So how can a psychiatrist say this is bipolar, and the drug has demasked that you have bipolar, and now we can see it, so we are happy? How can the psychiatrist know that it's not just side effects, and that the child would be better if you took off the ADHD drug rather than now adding an antipsychotic or lithium or whatever? I asked a professor in bipolar about this, and he said, I can see that because I'm a psychiatrist, but it's the same symptoms, more or less. So he cannot see that. It's not possible. Now, Joseph Biederman from Harvard He and his co-workers made a diagnosis of bipolar in 1/4 of the children they had first harmed by giving them an ADHD diagnosis. Then they called them bipolar. And the incidence of bipolar in the States is devastating. It has a 40-fold increase from, in just this little time period. We are just talking about 8 years. Great job, Joseph Biederman. He has harmed the children to an incredible extent in America. He's very influential. And then they have these signs outside American school, drug-free zone, and then 10% get amphetamine-like drugs that they sometimes sell in the street. That's gorgeous. And then how many people are killed by psychiatric drugs? That's very difficult to work out. I have done my best and came up with more than 500,000 deaths annually in the USA and Europe. It may be an overestimate, but it's the best data I could find. And if true, it makes psychiatric drugs the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. It may be somewhat exaggerated. I don't postulate anything else, but it's my best estimate. And there is no doubt that these drugs kill an enormous amount of people. And then we don't know how many, because the drug industry leaves out deaths in their trial reports. Half of the suicides and half of the deaths just disappear, just like the FDA suicides disappeared. This is magic. So, what do the public think? There's a huge survey here of 2,000 people from the general public. They thought that antidepressants, antipsychotics, electroshock, admission to a psychiatric ward were more often harmful than beneficial. Now listen, this is the general public's view of psychiatry. That's not what they think about cardiology or whatever, specialty orthopedics. That's your specialty, Teppo. That's not what they say. They're grateful for your job. This should alert the psychiatrist, but of course they just need some psychoeducation and then they'll think differently. This view concurs with the best evidence we have, but the social psychiatrists who had done the survey were dissatisfied with the answers and argued that people should be trained to arrive at the right opinion. So there you have it. Well, almost all trials are done by the drug industry. They are terribly flawed, they are not adequately blinded, cold turkey in the placebo group, fraudulent trials, miscoding of outcomes, missing deaths, totally unreliable trial literature, widespread corruption, lies in marketing and clinical practice. I'm not extreme, I'm just telling you how it is. And now I shall finish very soon, but just look at this slide. What do you do with psychotherapy? You go from normal to being sick. Then you try to push people back towards normal by supporting them. What do you do with psychiatric drugs? You go from normal to sick, then you change the brain, so you are up here in a third state. You are neither that state nor that state. You can't come back from that state to being normal. At least it's very difficult. You need to stop these drugs slowly in people. So you actually harm the brain. That's what all psychiatric drugs do, include, and also electroshock. And then you say, it's good for you, but I've harmed your brain, numbed your feelings, making it more difficult for you to think and be creative perhaps, and have sex above all. Great. So, these drugs decrease interest, disengagement, lack of empathy. They cause lack of empathy, loss of concern for themselves and others, and for life in general, emotional blunting, apathy, loss of higher critical human functions related to motivation, creativity, and love, above all. And these toxic effects of drugs and electroshock, where patients seem less disturbed or disturbing are easier to control, are interpreted as an improvement, but they're actually brain injuries. That's my good friend Peter Gøtzsche, the psychiatrist in America. And empathy helps us recognize the suffering we inflict on others. And reducing empathy is one way that psychiatric drugs can lead to suicide and violence. And this helps explain why psychiatry throughout history has resorted to all forms of trauma in the name of treatment. It is time to face the truth that psychiatric treatments work by damaging our brains sufficiently to take the edge off our humanity by making us less caring and engaged with our lives. That's also Peter Breggin. So I had 2 chapters on psychiatry in that book, and I have a full book about it here. So most of my documentation is in these books. There are more than 1,000 references there. And I've also explained why most of the psychiatric research are pseudo-research. It doesn't have the aim of arriving at the truth, but more to support unsustainable beliefs in psychiatry. I'm sorry, but this is my conclusion after having studied this for 10 years. It's very sad, really. Thank you.
Let's see if this works now. Thank you, Peter. Due to technical difficulties, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Teppo Järvinen, and I'm an orthopedic surgeon, as Peter mentioned. And I have been approached once I introduced your acceptance of this invitation to come over here. I have been asked, why on earth does an orthopedic surgeon mingle into something that he doesn't understand anything about? And ladies and gentlemen, this was a lecture about clinical epidemiology, about how to do research, how to interpret research. And this kind of thinking is the foundation of medicine. And when I was listening to this, it occurred to me that, first of all, a lot of questions, but one being, how many times have you been invited to psychiatry clinics to discuss, to have an open dialogue on these issues?
I love the term open dialogue because I'm so impressed about what they are doing in Lapland. So thank you, Teppo. I get invited now and then, but not very often, by the Psychiatric Society of Madrid. They are fond of psychotherapy. That might be why I was invited. And also by Danish psychiatrists earlier, but after I pointed out to them that they were wrong, the invitations have stopped. And now and then there are some invitations, yes, but it's pretty uncommon. And one of the most well-known professors in Denmark, he constantly says that I don't want the dialogue, which is completely wrong. I love debating with people. So it's just something he invents. Because in the Danish Psychiatric Society, I heard that they recently had a meeting where a psychiatrist was critical towards his colleagues and said, why don't you debate with Peter Gøtzsche? Because there's a lot of interesting stuff there, he probably said. And then that other guy said, well, I don't want the dialogue. I mean, complete rubbish. Of course I would love to discuss with psychiatrists. But in Finland, you don't want the dialogue. And now I shall tell you a very bad story. I published an article on MAD in America, which is a fantastic website. 200,000 visitors every month. If you're interested in psychiatry, go look up MAD in America. It's fantastic. It's one of my good friends who is behind this. I published this paper where I summarized my review in healthy volunteers and in middle-aged women with urinary leakage, and told people these drugs are dangerous for everyone and they should not be used. Then a colleague here in Finland, I don't know if I'm allowed to say his name, he's a psychologist, a guy I've met,
he said, shouldn't we translate this into Finnish and publish it in the Finnish Medical Journal? Which he did for me. And then there was a PhD, a doctor, who said, that's fine, we will have this article, but it's a bit too long, so you need to shorten it. So I shortened it and submitted it again, and then I thought it'll be published in Suomen Lääkärilehti. Then a month later, I got an email from the editor-in-chief that just said, no, we won't publish this, because it has been published before. Then I wrote back and said, that wasn't a problem when your deputy editor approved the article. Don't you think Finnish doctors should know how dangerous these antidepressant drugs are? And then I said, in 2012, I published something on mammography screening in your journal, which I had published before in English, and you knew that, and that was not a problem. Have you introduced new guidelines in your journal so that you don't do that any longer? And then I said, where can I complain about your decision? Do you have an ethical committee? Do you have an ombudsman? And then I also said, it is, according to international guidelines, it's totally unacceptable to withdraw a paper you have already accepted. You are only allowed to do that if there are major, major problems with the research, which means fraud. There was no problems with my paper. He insisted that he wouldn't publish. And he wouldn't even tell me where I could complain or whether they had an ethical board. Told me nothing. Then we looked him up. He's not a doctor, he's an engineer. He works mainly with business, and he tweets about business and finances. Is that the right guy to turn down my scientific article that a PhD and doctor has previously accepted? And why did he do it? Then I wrote a letter to the Finnish Medical Association that owns Suomen Lääkärilehti and complained. And then I was told by the president of the Finnish Medical Association, we respect editorial freedom. What about respecting me? And what about respecting international guidelines for publication ethics? What about respecting these hundreds of thousands of Finnish people who are wrongly treated with antidepressant drugs? What about respecting that the Finnish Medical Journal is about informing Finnish doctors about what they need to know? What is it you are respecting? I didn't say that to him. I was so astonished that I didn't do anything more. But then I published the affair on Mad in America called Editorial Misconduct in the Finnish Medical Journal. And then I also published the Finnish translation that Finns are not supposed to know anything about on Mad in America. And now I've been interviewed today by 2 newspapers and Science Radio. I've told them about the story, and I've told all 3 of them, please communicate this. Misconduct, whether it's scientific or editorial, should always be exposed. We should not let people get away with that.
Okay, I'm about to give you guys a chance to ask Peter questions, but one more thing. I read an interview in a very high-impact journal called Iltalehti, which is a daily magazine, of your previous visit. And it described you saying that when I see an elephant, I don't call it a big mammal, I call it an elephant. And you sure call things by the name they are.
Oh, now I see what you're getting at.
But okay, any questions?
Yeah.
I'm gonna bring the mic to each and everyone, and Max, if you could help me or someone. So here is the first question.
Thank you for interesting presentation. I would like to comment you on the editorial misconduct. Unfortunately, that happens in Finland. That happened to me just recently. Probably many of you here know about multiple chemical sensitivity. This is an increasing disease. It is a kind of environmental disorder. And here in Finland, the majority of people that suffers from this disorder, they had mold exposure, indoor air problem. It's a huge problem here in Finland. I presented an overview of multiple chemical sensitivity, and it was rejected without any explanation from the editor. There was only one reviewer, and he represented, or she, the view of our insurance companies. You probably know that people who are dealing with this issue, they are from National Institute of Occupational Health, and they are involved with insurance companies.
Journals turn down manuscripts for all sorts of reasons. So what happened to you is not editorial misconduct. It's not. It's something else. They weren't interested in your study, which can have all sorts of explanations. And I will not go into this now because I haven't seen your paper. But just to say this is not editorial misconduct. It's something else. And they might have had a reason for turning you down. What you describe, we experience all the time. Also, Teppo. We can have made the best research in the world, and it's turned down because of some sour peer reviewers who are trying to protect their little hobby horses, and then you go to some other journal and publish it there. So things happen all the time. But could I ask the audience to, now it had to do with editors, but otherwise stay strictly to psychiatry, which is the subject for the evening.
And if you can introduce yourself before asking. Sorry, I forgot to ask. So we had the next question there. I hope the microphone works, but apparently it doesn't. Let's see if I can. I'll bring this to you.
Okay, thanks.
Here you go.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting talk. My name is Nico Liljelund, and my question is related to the treatment of severe depression, in specific to research that has been conducted by, for example, Dr. Carhart Harris from the Imperial College of London, and they've been using a substance called psilocybin for the treatment of severe depression. I would like to know, have you read this research? Have you familiarized yourself with it? And what are your thoughts on using, for example, psilocybin in the treatment of severely depressed people? Thanks.
Yeah. Shall I just talk? Or should I wait for you, Teppo?
Why don't you wait?
Okay. Well, I have ADHD. I can't help it.
Okay, I'm sorry. I know about this drug, that it exists, and I have not followed it closely, so I can't help you with that. But I can tell you to be cautious, because for the last 50 years, the big breakthrough in psychiatry has been just around the corner. And they have stated it again and again and again in their annual reports. And we are still looking for Godot. So don't be too optimistic when a new drug pops up that in the first publication looks promising. It may not hold, and you don't know what the serious harms are yet, I suppose. So, well, and now you're talking about severe depression. I'm often told by psychiatrists that, well, at least antidepressants work for very severe depression. That's not true either. It's actually not true. So there is no justification for using these drugs.
Did we have another question? I saw a hand. Okay.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. Is this on? Yeah. So my name is Jesper and I'm a professor of psychiatry, and for my last 20 years I've been dedicating myself to the understanding of causes and treatments of psychiatric disorders. So, but thank you very much for bringing this very important theme up about this huge trend that did happen, partly a little late, of course, since of course those big trends, big patented drugs that made billions, of course, are a little bit of history now. But anyway, it's a very important theme, of course, and medicalization of normal issues and all that thing is a very important theme. Of course, as a professional in the field, I could of course comment on like the view of course psychiatrists that they, according to what you present, you have to either be extremely stupid or extremely corrupt. Of course, this only the two options I see to end up on this. So I guess I cannot be the one to take a stand on the first one, but of course on the second one I'm pretty convinced that there is no such issue in the Scandinavian countries at the moment, at least for the last years. You do a lot of claims like psychiatry has become a checklist and modern psychiatry history is not given much value, or side effects are interpreted as disorders. That I don't agree with. I don't believe that's true, actually. I think we teach that very a lot, really a lot in medical school and in the training of psychiatrists. But okay, let's go. I accept that those claims though are quite provocative to me, but I guess they are kind of, your style or whatever I would call it. Then there's a lot of statements also about corruptions or conspiracy theories, basically that authorities don't want to admit their mistakes. That's why they cover up, basically, and that psychiatrists make millions. I know, of course, of the court cases in the United States of these relationships between the drug industry in the 90s, but I mean that's quite far from the truth in present world, in our part of the world, of course. So, okay, again, that's going to be quite provocative, but I'll leave those. Then, of course, there's a lot of basic issues that you claim quite strongly that there is no such thing as ADHD. We can talk about over-medicalization, we can talk about over-diagnosis, but to state, that there is no such thing at all, for those people severely affected, I think is quite actually provocative and actually a little bit insulting, actually, even. And those, even you present things that are clearly like, untrue, and I'm sure you know that also. Like you say that 300,000 people in Finland are treated with antidepressants for things as divorce and failed an exam and stuff like that. That, of course, I hope that's certainly not true. I mean, that is not in any way the way we teach them.
In bits because
no. These are just things. No. These are just things that I actually I will come to actually the main point, which I think we can. This is just the background. The main point, I think, which I kind of would like to challenge you on. These other are just observations, and that's basically your style or your way of writing things. But the main thing that I want to challenge you on is actually the double standards here, because you are extremely severely criticizing or looking at the studies and looking at small flaws and calling them absurd studies and things like this. Of course, all studies have their issues, but then again, you make claims. For example, you claim about that we know that akathisia is the main mechanism behind suicidal ideation. I don't know that. I don't think that's true, actually. You make very bold statements on issues that are not really very strongly. You show a correlation between SSRI and disability. Of course, you very well know that proves nothing. And you very well know that if you correlate, for example, suicides and SSRI use in Finland, there's a very strong correlation going down during the last 20 years. So, of course, I mean, you all know all these issues, but you use a very double standard for the things you want to discredit and the things you want to credit. There's like, I've been writing during the talk like 20 examples of this discrediting or using double standards for the things you want to show you showed, for example, Pfizer study showing a relative risk of 1.47 for suicide, and you call that strong evidence that it increases the risk of suicide. While in the same slide, you showed that the confidence interval was 0.77 to 1.9. So of course that doesn't show that. Do you know very well, as a smart guy and a good researcher, of course you know that that's not strong proof that it increases suicide, but you still say that. So that's if somebody would claim the opposite, like a beneficial effect, I'm sure you would hit on that quite strongly. So I think you quite, actually, my point is that according to this talk, I think you are using a double standard very strongly. Can you please comment on that?
But before I let you go, he's a good guy. And I actually invited all of my psychiatry fellow professors here. I don't know how many are here, but you are here. And I highly appreciate this, because the fact that we need dialogue, and we need people like you, Jesper, to stand up and discuss these issues. Peter, quite a challenge here, I would say, but let's see what you have to say about this.
Yeah. First of all, I don't discuss small biases, as you indicated. I discuss really major issues like the lack of blinding, the psychiatrists that could see the exact opposite as what chlorpromazine does to people. That is a major, major flaw. It's not nitty-gritty things. And the one about suicide risk going up to a 50% increase, of course I know perfectly well the confidence interval in that, and I just used it as an illustration that when Pfizer looks at its own data, it looks better. Unless they incorporate 30 days, then it looks the opposite. And this agrees very well with everything else I have presented. I don't build my whole presentation on that single issue. I just used it for illustration purposes. And I have had a number of things today where I said, how can psychiatrists say this? How can they say that these drugs are not addictive with the argument that then you need to crave bigger and bigger doses? This is just plain wrong. And then saying that the patients need psychoeducation if they feel they become dependent, that is disrespect for the patients. They say this consistently. And it is so big a problem that I created an institute in October in Göteborg called the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. And we will have a course for psychiatrists and other professionals in April. It is full already in April and October. I will have my own course in Copenhagen for everybody, patients, relatives, psychiatrists, psychologists, pharmacists, everybody, to teach people how to taper off drugs safely, because very few people know how to do it. So I'm actually trying to help people to do something about it. And of course, not all psychiatrists are either stupid or corrupt, but there are enough leading psychiatrists that behave as if they are very foolish. And I cannot tell you why they do that. Why do they speak about the chemical imbalance? Everyone knows this is not true. And it's a very harmful lie. So, and then when you give a lecture, it's not a PhD defense I have given today, it's a lecture, and you want a lecture to be interesting. And then I agree with you that maybe you do it a little too interesting, perhaps, and don't go into too much detail with the science, then it wouldn't be interesting for the audience. So that's just the way I give lectures. And then I actually can't remember all the other things you said because you said so much. But yeah, oh yeah, about that I am not fair. I have a double standard when I review things that suits my idea, and then if it fits my idea, then it's fine, no problems. And if it doesn't fit my idea, it's not fine. That's not how I work. I was co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration. I've been there for 24 years. I try to be critical whatever I look at. And these studies about suicide, disability pension, for example, you are right that a correlation doesn't prove causality, but this correlation exists everywhere. And it's not the only documentation we have. We have a lot else, which I also said, that antipsychotics clearly make it difficult for people to work. So there is a good reason to believe that it makes things worse. Then I showed the wondering study that people fared better if they got less antipsychotics. I talked about Psychola, which showed that people fared much better and were back to work if we didn't give them antipsychotics. And then you can say that was not a randomized trial. No, it wasn't, but it was very convincing because these patients were very similar in Stockholm and Lapland, and the results were extremely different. And then we have what I did not mention, the WHO studies, that when the WHO looked how it went in poor countries that couldn't afford antipsychotics, it went far better with schizophrenia patients than in the Western world. It was so surprising to the WHO that they did a new study that showed the same. So there is a lot of research that tells us the same story. So I don't think you are fair when you say I have double standards, because I have a lot else documentation, but I need to select what to present in order to convince people psychiatry needs a major revolution where only perhaps 2% of the drugs used today are going to be used in future, because it's very harmful. I'm not the only one who have come to the conclusion that psychiatric drugs do far more harm than good. Many very good psychiatrists have come to the same conclusion, actually. So, but well, I'm sorry, we can't go into all the detail. I'm just trying to respond.
We have a question, but let me continue by saying this. As an orthopedic surgeon, I shouldn't mingle into this, but this is how I see it. We have a disease. We have a drug that is very widely used, and I'm talking about the SSRI drug class. We have meta-analysis that show that the effect is something that the patients can't detect. That's clinically irrelevant. The better the studies, the worse the effect. And these are facts that have been shown. And then I look at arthroscopic partial meniscectomy, the procedure that we showed that is like sham. Did the orthopedic surgeons, when the evidence started to accumulate, did they start barking? Did they run somewhere and ask for this procedure to be stopped from being reimbursed? Hello, guys. This is probably your biggest drug class. Either have the evidence to show if it's this questionable, you have a problem. You have a problem that even an idiot like an orthopedic surgeon can tell. The better the study, the worse the outcome. This is a classic case of an intervention in medicine that doesn't work, period. Sorry to say that.
There is one thing that was very important for me to say. You disagreed a lot about psychiatrists interpreting side effects as a new disease, and I just disagree immensely with you. I'm sure you do the right things and you try to educate coming psychiatrists to do the right things, but that's not what the evidence tells us. A huge amount of people in psychiatry have several diagnoses and many drugs. And one of the major reasons for this is that side effects of one drug is interpreted as a new disease, and then they get another drug. This has been documented in the scientific literature. And in my country, for example, the National Board of Health has complained that psychiatrists very often give benzodiazepines to people who are on antipsychotics because they say it increases the risk of death by 50%. That's what the Danish National Board of Health says. So 10 years ago, they called for action. You should not use both types of drugs in people. What happened 10 years later? It's the same. Half of the patients still get this cocktail of two drugs that our National Board of Health says increase the risk of dying. That is simply not good medicine. And now I'm not talking about Finnish psychiatrists. I'm talking about Danish psychiatrists, so you can relax. But that is the kind of documentation I have. And I have started to read psychiatric patient files. And it's really shocking for me. because very rarely is there anything about why did that patient develop a psychosis? What traumas went before that? Traumas increase the risk tremendously for psychosis later in life, sexual abuse in childhood and all sorts of things. Whereas when you ask the psychiatrist, there is a study of that, most of them say it's genetic when you get schizophrenia. It's not genetic. The genetic link is very, very weak, but the trauma link is very high. So why don't the psychiatrist ask, what happened to you? Why did you become psychotic now? What is your history? I very rarely see this in the patient files. They don't take the history. And then patients write to me. For example, it took 10 years before I met a nice person who asked me about my history. And only then did I reveal I had been sexually abused as a child. Then psychotherapy started. Then the healing started. And the patient actually became well and got rid of her antipsychotic drugs. I received so many of these stories. So I believe psychiatrists should go back to what they had before the psychiatric drugs, that they talk much more with the patients, get their story, give them psychotherapy, individualize that. And when I said that ADHD should not be a disease, that's a philosophical question. I agree to that. It's my personal conviction. This is a social construct. But the national, what is it called, NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, are now so dissatisfied with the diagnosis invented by the American Psychiatric Association, so they recommend that they are not being used. They should not be used in future psychiatric research because they are so unreliable. I think that is also something we need to take into account. I mean, in the rest of medicine, the diagnoses are much more reliable than in psychiatry. I realize it's a difficult specialty. It obviously is. It's more easy to be a specialist in internal medicine, which I am, or an orthopedic surgeon. It's a difficult one. But, well...
Hello, my name is Carla. Thank you very much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. I am the kind of person who patients go to when they have totally lost hope on their medical treatments. I'm a well-being coach, life coach, public speaker, inspirational speaker, you call it. And I would say that even though I don't have all the amount of research or even the experience that you have, I can say that just by talking to these people, all what you say really sounds true. Now, given that, I subjected myself to a very interesting experience, and I apologize for that to all the psychiatrists here. So I went into a psychiatric treatment to understand what patients were going through, and it's not nice in Finland either. First thing you get offered is drugs, and yeah, that is very sad. Anywho, but that's not my question. My question is far more interesting. There was a doctor, I don't know if you have heard of him, in Germany, Dr. Hammer, founder of the New German Medicine. Anyway, so he, like you, was very critical on treatments, mostly chemotherapy. And he did research, whatnot, exactly like you. But he got banned, and his reputation was totally destroyed. And he's totally... can I just ask my question?
Yeah, please don't go into other subjects. Chemotherapy is not psychiatry.
No. My point is, he got banned. He got removed his medical license by, publishing these things. How have you managed to stay alive with your publications and not been banned?
Well, first of all, let's stick to psychiatry. There are all sorts of good reasons why people are on the wrong track. Many German doctors are on the wrong track, and they are quacks, basically. So this one might have been one of these, because there are randomized trials that show us very clearly the survival benefit for various chemotherapeutic regimens. So this has been very well documented. So to try to say that this is not true, then you are likely a knothead. I'm sorry, I don't know the guy, I don't know the story, but let's stick to psychiatry. And I'm a scientist, I am not into alternative medicine, which I regard as mostly, almost, all of it, quack. It doesn't work. Because if it did work, it would not be alternative medicine, it would just be medicine. And we doctors would be happy to use it. So don't think that I am supporting alternative medicine and all sorts of weird ideas. I do not. I'm a scientist. I want documentation that something is more beneficial than harmful, no matter what it is. And now you asked me a question. How could I survive? How could I...
So critical against the very big industry, which is the pharma industry. How have you survived?
Well...
How have you been still alive and not banned?
Well, what could they do to me? I have a good track record. I am the only Dane that has ever published more than 70 papers in the 5 best journals in the world. British Medical Journal, Lancet, and such journals. I'm the only one. So I have a good academic reputation. They can't take that away from me. Then they can say they don't like my style, as you don't do. Well, that's personal. That's like if you, I don't like sushi, for example. So that's really up to people to like or not like. I don't care. I have my style. And so what could people do to me? They could drag me in court. But since what I write in my books are well documented, what would the drug industry get out of dragging me to court? I would sell more books. That's not in their interest. So I can guarantee you they have held meetings about me. What should we do with that guy? And they can be pretty smart, so they have realized it's best to leave me alone.
Okay. And are you the only one, or do you have support or other people around
Oh
you
yeah.
doing the
Oh
same?
yeah. I'm a member of many networks. For example, Critical Psychiatry Network, which is based in the UK and mostly consists of psychiatrists. So they are happy to have me in there because I'm critical and I don't tell rubbish. I come with documentation for my views, why I have them. I don't have the views first. I look at the science and then I form an opinion based on that. So we have a lot of interesting email discussion there. And I was one of the founders of Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry in the UK and now one of the founders for International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, where there are also psychiatrists on board. So there are actually many good people and very many good psychiatrists who realize that something is badly wrong. Something went badly wrong with their specialty. They need a whole new direction. And this group is growing. So we are going in the right direction. I'm definitely not alone.
How are you fund yourself?
Thank you, but I mean, let's respect the fact that this can't be a dialogue between two people. Sorry about that. I am leaning towards letting Jesper ask another question for being attacked by Peter's views. If I can, and then we have some other hands here. We will probably be closing this session in about 10 to 15 minutes. Otherwise, we will have to eat sushi rather than something else. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just briefly, I totally agree, of course, that there's a lot of issues and a lot of problems. The medicalization of our whole society is a huge issue, and psychiatry, of course, is in the center of that debate. I totally agree with you, and there's many issues that need to be addressed, and also the mechanism of treatments. How do they work? How do medications work? How do psychotherapy work? And everything is a highly interesting research field, of course. That's not the point at all. It's a very nice spin, of course, to turn that discussion into criticism versus non-criticism, of course. But it's not. That's not the fact. But so I have to throw the ball back to you. You say things like, likely all of them SSRIs will cause brain damage if used extensively. You said in this talk. You said also, which I would, of course, be interested in the evidence behind that statement. You mentioned all of these horrible school shootings, German wings and everything, that you mentioned that they have been using SSRIs. As a scientist, of course, you know that those observations are not causative. I mean, that doesn't prove any causation, of course, at all. It's an interesting observation, but of course you understand. But you say, and I quote, so we know that this is a problem with antidepressants. You claim that in this talk today.
Yeah.
You know as a scientist that you cannot make such a claim. This is really. And you criticize people for bad science, and you still do this.
I can.
I don't understand this. This is double standard very much.
No, I can, and I will explain it to you now. I definitely can, because the problem with public performances is that you don't get all the data. So now I'll give you some more data. How can I say that likely all psychiatric drugs can cause permanent brain damage if you take them long enough? That's what my scientific studies have made me believe. And one of these who knows most about this is Peter Gøtzsche in America. He has studied this for a lifetime. He's 80 years old now. He has written about 20 books. And I have even done studies on that. For example, we have looked at animal studies, rats that were exposed to SSRIs, and then there was a long break where they did not get SSRIs, and then their sexual performance was tested. And yes.
So you quote a friend and you quote rat studies, and that's your evidence.
I'm not finished.
I think that's enough.
I'm not finished. I'm not finished. You should listen. These rats got sexually disturbed long after they came off the drugs. We have published an article on that. That indicates that these SSRIs can cause permanent brain damage. Then there is a study of people who have been on SSRIs who continue to be sexually disturbed years after they came off the antidepressant drugs. But let's turn to something more interesting. How can I know that akathisia predisposes to suicide?
Causes it, you say. Causes.
Pardon?
Causes it, you say. It's the major driver behind it. Causes.
Well, let me explain. In clinical pharmacology, it is an accepted principle that if people complain of something terribly happening to them, then you can take the drug away from them. Then you can re-expose them to this drug. And if they have the same reaction, it becomes pretty likely that this is caused by the drug. This is an accepted method in clinical pharmacology. Not everything is about randomized trials. Some things we cannot study in randomized trials. This has been done, for example, for akathisia, that shows, yes, the same person get akathisia again and again and again when they're exposed to these drugs. And now I'll give you one example. I was an expert witness in a Dutch court case. This is an accepted principle in clinical pharmacology.
Yeah, but now you're proving that drugs cause akathisia. That's not what we're talking about. You say akathisia is the major driver behind suicide. Well, I guess we can't get forward.
If you look at there is one study in psychiatric wards that show that half of all fights at psychiatric wards between patients is related to akathisia. So now we're talking about violence, which it also predisposes to, in my view, after having studied the science. But let me just give you one example, a terrible one. I was an expert witness in Holland. A young mother was put on an antidepressant drug for no good reason. She developed violent nightmares about cutting the throats of her 2 small children. She developed akathisia, which I know predisposes to suicide and murder. In my view, you may disagree. Her psychiatrist didn't do anything, just continue with the drugs. Then one morning, she cut the throat of her 2 children. So she became a murderer. She did exactly what her nightmares were about. And this is a well-known side effect of SSRIs, violent nightmares. Akathisia is a well-known side effect, also of antipsychotics. There is so much in the scientific literature, but you and I cannot, in a public performance like this, come much closer to that.
No, but you prove my point very well. When I ask you to comment on it, you take one case report, which is, of course, as you know, as a scientist, not the way to prove this to your team, and you turn the argument. In your talk, say that akathisia is the main mechanism behind suicide. You don't comment on that. You cite rat studies showing that drugs cause akathisia, which of course is self-evident. but you don't comment on the actual issue. So this is the way of your style, your pedagogic style. I don't respect that, but thank you for the talk. It's a very important issue, and we need to keep doing research on this, of course.
Thank you. We both agree on the need to have better evidence.
Yes.
For the 300,000 people on SSRIs. So far it looks like arthroscopic knee surgery, where the benefits are minimal, the harms are possible, and the costs are enormous. I have a suggestion. I highly appreciate the fact that Jesper, you are here, and I really think that this discussion, this dialogue should continue. But I truly also feel that this isn't the appropriate place. I actually asked, and I have a feeling that I could convince Peter to come over here. So why don't you convince your peers, and I can pay for Peter's flights, and let's do this again. And if you guys want to continue, you can also continue online. Make it public. Because I was told something that really troubles me about the last visit Peter was here. Because that time there was a debate also, and the debate was supposed to continue online, but then it stopped. I think we have an amazing disagreement here, which could be fruitful for our patients, but we are not going to finish it here. I had a lot of hands, or we had a lot of hands, so let's continue.
Okay, thank you for your lecture. My name is Soili Takkala, and I would like to use my time to present the other side of the view, because I have been running a support group for SSRI drug withdrawals here in Helsinki for 1.5 years. And actually nothing you tell us is new for me. I've heard all the stories. I've also acquainted myself with the material. And I just wanted to sort of bring the view from the drug user's point of view. I used to be a depression patient. I started SSRI in the beginning of the 90s, and that went chronic due to the medicine. And I suddenly miraculously recovered when I finally managed to quit, something like 5 years ago. And then I thought that if one day these experiences will be helpful to any other people with same kind of problems, I will be willing to put in any time and effort to sort of bring forth this message. And after Aku Kopakkala here was sacked from Mehiläinen, having spoken of these issues in public TV, that prompted me to start this mission. And we have now started a new organization trying to sort of provide appropriate information about psychiatric drugs and to create other forms of support for people. Actually, my point is that the reason behind all this, like the SSRI medicine and the depression epidemic, is that the model of the mind behind the model of the mind in biological psychiatry is wrong. And probably, I mean, if depression is not a disease, I claim that it is not a brain disease. It is not a chemical imbalance in the brain, but it is a reaction to something. There is a sort of a discontinuation or disruption between the relationship between you and the world. It's a reaction to loss and trauma and things like that. And this is not treatable by medicine. And this is where it starts. So there is actually not a question in here. I just sort of wanted to bring up this side from the user's side, so to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Two things. I just have a couple of Finnish names on a list with people who are willing to help people getting off psychiatric drugs. So if some of you do this who are here tonight, then please send me an email, because I get very many emails from desperate patients who cannot get any help getting off psychiatric drugs. They don't know where to go. So I want to expand that list, and maybe it looks like you are one of them. So please, yeah, please write to me. That's the one thing. The other thing is, I think we should be a bit careful. My own view on ADHD is that it shouldn't be used that way. But there are genuinely people who are suffering from depression, from psychosis, from a lot else. And I think it is okay to call these disorders or illnesses or diseases because they are suffering from something. So I think we should be careful not to say depression is not a disease, it's not a brain disease, because if it's not in the brain, then where is it? I mean, it all happens in your brain. And then it's another thing that of course it can have a lot to do with your surroundings, your interactions with other people and traumas and all that sort of thing. But it does happen up here. It doesn't happen in your kidneys or in your heart. So I'm very cautious not to say that it hasn't anything to do with what happened. Of course, it does happen in the brain, but we are far too little occupied today with external factors. The biopsychosocial model has degenerated into a biomodel that has proved very harmful for the patients. So there we agree completely.
Okay, sorry, but this is going to be the last question.
Hello, my name is Leena Mattila, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a biologist and a journalist. And I was some years ago. I was in Berlin in a rehabilitation seminar or something like that. And in Berlin, they told that the biggest problem with drugs in Germany is not illegal drugs. They are the legal drugs that are ordered by doctors. People are addicted to those drugs, and this was, I think, 5 years ago, and they admitted it then already.
Yes, I agree with you completely. If you look at the numbers who are dependent on alcohol or on illegal drugs, like cocaine and heroin, and then compare it to the number who are dependent on psychiatric drugs, there is an enormous difference. But what is it we have? We have institutions that help alcoholics and drug addicts that use street drugs. But we have done virtually nothing to help the much bigger group that have become addicted to psychiatric drugs. So this is what we need to focus on. And I'm also involved in an initiative in the UK, which is in collaboration with a parliamentary committee, that we want to do something and establish a national helpline, a telephone line, so people can come in and say, help, I'm dependent on this SSRI, and where can I get help coming off it? So these initiatives are happening in the UK right now. And I'll do what I can to try to make them happen everywhere. There were a number of helping clinics in Sweden where they help people get off psychiatric drugs, but they were all closed down. And then you can ask why. Why is that the case when there is such a huge need? Very often, when very good initiatives become closed down, it is follow the money. It's because of the drug industry and its relations to politicians. It's almost always the drug industry that kills some of the best initiatives we have, that go against their interests.
Okay. With that, I think it's time to thank Peter for taking 2.5 hours almost. And as my last words, please remember that this isn't about believing. This is about understanding. And I think the biggest message, the biggest lesson Peter gave us today is that if you understand what he's talking about, if you understand the evidence, then this thing becomes a lot more than just believing in something. Although you said that you believe in something, and I was a bit disappointed because we do have a lot of too many people who believe rather than understand and act accordingly.
Could I have the last word, please? I have a quote that I sometimes use from Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion. You know, the biologist who wrote There is no God and here are the reasons why. He once said on BBC, we should not believe in anything for which there is no evidence. That's actually also my standpoint, so I'm sorry I made a mistake.
Hey, if somebody says that Peter Gøtzsche never admits that he has made a mistake, he just did. Thank you.
Okay.